Hello, YouTube. I will continue with my investigation of the Dyatlov Pass tragedy and bring more interesting materials, basically unknown in the West, of course. So today we'll talk about the truth about the death of the hikers, the Dyatlov Pass, that was hidden by the investigator, and also unknown letters of Lev Ivanov, who investigated this high-profile case. They were recently published. And so we're dealing with the unknown memoirs of the investigator Lev Ivanov and information that has come up, and the analysis by the Russian journalists Nikolai and Natalia Varsegov, relentless investigators of this case, and reporters for Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper. And like I said, I will continue to bring most interesting information from the files of those who want to solve this mysterious case, albeit almost 65 years after the horrifying event. You have seen my reports in the various programs through the years on television, and you have seen my videos as well. And I think today you will learn a few more interesting things. But I will also include the headings that the Varsegovs gave to the different sections of their presentation. It starts like this. In the winter of 1959, 9 hikers disappeared in the mountains of the northern Urals. A fifth-year student of the Ural Polytechnic Institute, the head of the group Igor Dyatlov, as well as Yuri Krivonishenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Rustem Slobodin, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Kalivatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol, and Semyon Zolotaryov. In 16 days, the participants of the hike had to ski at least 300 kilometers in the north of the Sverdlovsk region and climb 2 peaks of the northern Urals. The hike belonged to the 3rd highest difficulty category. A month later, rescuers found an empty hiker tent, and within a radius of 1.5 kilometers from it, 5 frozen bodies. The corpses of the others were found only in May. Almost all the hikers were barefoot and half naked. Some had fatal injuries. According to investigators, the hikers died on the night of February 1st to February 2nd. But it is still not solved why the young people ran away from the tent in the bitter cold and to their doom. Because of this understatement, dozens of different hypotheses of the tragedy have appeared in our time, from an avalanche to an attack by a snowman, abominable snowman. In 1959, the criminal prosecutor of the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office, Lev Nikitich Ivanov, was investigating the death of the hikers. The man was incredibly scrupulous, meticulous, and accurate. Where do such conclusions come from? Well, firstly, from his colleagues with whom the Varsegovs talked. The deputy head of the investigative department of the prosecutor's office of the Sverdlovsk region, Evgeny Okyshev, and investigator Leonid Drapkin spoke about Ivanov in this way. Secondly, Lev Nikitich Ivanov pedantically kept a household diary almost until the end of his life. The last entry in it was made 2 weeks before his death. The author recorded the weather, prices, and events taking place in his country. But it is strange that there is not a word in the diary about the events of 1959, about this case. Even when journalists visited him in the 1990s, he did not mention it in his diary. But his letters to journalists, television, and other memories remained. Unfortunately, they did not reach Varsegovs in their full form. The surviving sheets were donated to the Dyatlov Group Memory Fund by his youngest daughter Alexandra. But even on their basis, very interesting conclusions can be drawn. So the Varsegovs bring to your attention with a small reduction, so to say. They redacted a few things. These letters with their comments. As for myself, I will be adding clarifying terms, explanations, to explain Soviet and Russian terminology and culture. For example, the Dyatlov Group participants in Russian are referred to quite often as tourists. The meaning here is sports tourism adherents or hikers. Also, when they say party, I want to underscore that we're speaking about the Communist Party in the presentation. And so did Ivanov. So the first heading is how it all started. Ivanov's writing. In the Urals, they still remember the death of a large group of students of the first set of the Faculty of Physics and Technology of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. In the 1950s, the whole Urals talked about this tragedy, and I had to investigate the case, find out the reasons for the circumstances of the death of these people. The events took place in the Arctic at the northernmost point of the Ural Ridge. A very large group of students, amateur hikers, penetrated there, and when they did not reach the checkpoint and all the deadlines for their return passed, the Regional Communist Party Committee and the Sverdlovsk Regional Government Executive Committee organized an expedition to find the people. I must say that the expedition was organized perfectly. We were given sappers, planes, and helicopters, experts in the field of sports, trackers, hunters from the Mansi people. We had tents, but the investigation had to be conducted, and I, a person unprepared in sports, had participated in this expedition. Note from the Varsegovs. It is strange that here and further Ivanov points to the Arctic, although the events take place in the northern Urals. It is also strange that the investigator calls Igor Dyatlov's group amateur tourists. What kind of amateur activity are we talking about? If it was organized, it was an organized team from the tour section of the Ural Polytechnic Institute with an approved itinerary, a hike schedule, and the qualifications of each of the participants. It is all the more surprising that Lev Nikitich Ivanov immediately writes that the order to search for amateurs came from the very top, from the regional authorities. Why suddenly? Isn't it because then, in 1959, and more than 30 years later, the criminal prosecutor makes the victims guilty? How can the dead refute this? 4 months in the mountains, that's the next heading. Ivanov's writing. I felt something was wrong from the moment I entered the office of the regional prosecutor and received an invitation to sit down. It was not customary for us to sit down during regular visits to the regional prosecutor, for the simple reason that we did not have to stay in the office. Among the 60 people of the regional apparatus, there were many people every day who wanted to get an appointment personally with the prosecutor of the region. I was given 30 minutes to get ready. New felt boots, a hat with ear flaps, and the same brand new sheepskin coat were handed to me right there in the office of the regional prosecutor by the head of the Administrative and Economic Service. And 30 minutes later, I was sitting on an airplane, which a few hours later took me by special flight to the city of Ivdel. Here it was decided to create a supply base for the search group. And what could I do? Had to go. Sending me to this case, the regional prosecutor explained to me that he hoped for my ability to investigate the case and for the hard experience of the front line soldier. Are you a paratrooper? He says. Yes, I am entrusting you with a difficult task. This trust has to be justified. It was a difficult expedition. We stayed in the Arctic, in the mountains, for 4 months without leaving. Frankly, by the end of this period, I had already pulled myself up as an athlete, but in the beginning, there were also curious cases. On the first day of skiing in the mountains, I had breakfast as usual and could not go with everyone. It turns out that it was necessary to eat very little, but high-calorie food from the Varsegovs. What miracles! Amateur tourists have gone to the mountains and vanished. The prosecutor of the region personally equips the investigator and even emphasizes it's difficult. Well, let's suppose so. Then Ivanov writes even more miraculous stuff. It turns out that he was in the expedition for 4 months without leaving. We just want to exclaim, and the men don't know? Ask any of the surviving searchers how long the investigator Ivanov was at the pass. They will answer just a few days. And according to the radiograms from the criminal case, it follows fully that Ivanov flew away from the pass on March 3rd. If we assume that he arrived at the scene on February 27 after the discovery of the first corpses, then it turns out to be 5 days. What 4 months? Plus, the evidence that he reappeared at the pass a second time when the bodies of the remaining 4 were taken out from under the snow. But as the searcher Vladimir Ashkenazy told, Lev Nikitich did not show any special interest in the bodies at that time. If during the first visit Ivanov was too energetic, initiative, now by his indifferent state, it was possible to assume that the essence of the tragedy was absolutely clear to the investigator. The next heading is No One Knew. Ivanov wrote the following in a letter dated March 8, 1991. Unfortunately, I am the only one left of those who know the true circumstances of this tragedy. It is necessary to make a presentation so that it becomes clear to you about the reliability of the source of information. From 1951 to 1962, I worked as a criminal prosecutor of the Sverdlovsk Regional Prosecutor's Office. According to my position, I was obliged to help investigate the most complex cases, and I took some cases of special complexity to my caseload. In 1959, on behalf of the regional prosecutor Klinov, I investigated this case. Apart from Karatayev, the former investigator of the prosecutor's office of Evdel, who started this case, you will not find anyone. No one in the prosecutor's office knew anything about this case, and those who knew did not say anything about it. In those days, it was not customary to talk about issues that were not assigned to you. Now, from the Varsegovs, Lev Nikitich is wrong here. The leadership of the regional prosecutor's office was well aware of the investigation of the death of the tourists. For example, is our interview with one of the Ivanov's colleagues, deputy head of the investigative department, Yevgeny Okashev. Next heading. So, officials or UFOs? Ivanov's writing. But there were also those who benefited from the silence. First of all, the director Gordo, or whatever his name is, was silent. He was one of the culprits of the fact that the team made a lot of mistakes. The head of the city sports committee was silent. I don't remember his last name because he was also guilty of the fact that the team, he's referring to the Dyatlov people, was semi-wild, passing at the final stage into the stage of wildness. I was quite surprised that at the Bureau, these two absolutely guilty people in the death of the young people, Dyatlovs, were slightly punished. Looks like they were given a reprimand, and this meant that it was impossible to bring them to criminal responsibility because they were members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, abbreviated as CPSU. and until very recently, until 1986, in force were the instruction of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the instruction letter of the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of the People's Commissars of the USSR, signed by Stalin and Molotov in 1939, on the elimination of serious perversions in the struggle with the enemies of the people. This letter stated that many cases of unjustified criminal prosecution of people are allowed on the ground. Abuses are allowed in the NKGB and NKVD bodies, in this case, referring to the precursors of the KGB. And it was suggested that a member of the CPSU could be brought to criminal responsibility only with the consent of the party committee, and he could be arrested only with the sanction of the first secretary personally. So the city and regional committees did not give such consent to the involvement of these two people. And that's it. The issue is resolved from the Varsegovs. A quote from the resolution on determination of the criminal case. Official. So they're referring to the official termination of the Dyatlov Pass investigation, the criminal case. For shortcomings in the organization of tourist work and weak control, the Bureau of the Sverdlovsk State Committee of the CPSU punished in the Communist Party order this. Director of the Ural Polytechnic Institute Siunov, Secretary of the Party Bureau Zaostrovsky, Chairman of the Trade Union Committee of the Ural Polytechnic College, that's what it says, Slobodin, Chairman of the City Union of Voluntary Sports Societies Kurachkin, and Union Inspector Ufimtsov. The Chairman of the Board of the Sports Club of the Institute, Gordo, was removed from the job. Indeed, officials were slightly punished, and a year later the reprimands were cancelled. Gordo was restored to his job. But that's not the point. In 1990, an article by Lev Ivanov about the Dyatlov group case was published in one of the Kazakhstan newspapers. Varsegovs have the full text in there. In it, Lev Nikitich explicitly hints that the cause of the group's death or demise were the mysterious fireballs, UFOs. Why, in a letter from 1991, the former investigator directly insists on the guilt of some officials in the death of the Dyatlov group members. And what is the deal with with Gordo here if the group was attacked by aliens? The new heading is Unknown Details. Ivanov's writing. I had to sort out everything of each deceased, conduct a variety of examinations, go through the path that turned out to be fatal for the group many times, and only after that I managed to clarify the tragedy in its details. We also managed to develop all the films exhibited by tourists. As always happens, personal presence at the autopsy of corpses gives a lot. All this helped to establish the truth. During a hurricane wind at the top of the mountain, where the tourists were caught in a storm and where they had to stay overnight, their tent was turned down and they were scattered along the slope. They could not overcome the wind at the speed of up to 40 meters per second and died in the cold. The high morale of these courageous people is amazing. The guys gave off their last shirt to the girls in order to somehow warm them up, and when one died, they carried him aside so it would not break in others the will to resist. Working on this case, I saw firsthand how great friendship and a sense of camaraderie our people have. From the Varsegovs is this comment. But this is serious. Why did the investigator Ivanov tell such a detailed story only 30 years later about how the young people died? Why these details are not in the criminal case? Let's say Lev Nikitich could have made up about the last shirt, but the wind at the speed of 40 meters per second, where did this come from? There is not a single weather report in the criminal case. Probably the hypothesis about the hurricane could be fictional, and the official weather service could not confirm the hurricane. Therefore, there are no certificates in this case. Heading: The prosecutor scolded himself. Ivanov's writing: There was such an episode. The snow hurricane did not subside for several days. Our tent was blown through, food was running out, and the helicopters could not help us in any way because of the bad weather. We received a radio message from the search headquarters to prepare for a ski crossing to the nearest settlement, which is 100 kilometers away from us. The regional prosecutor, who, together with the regional committee commission, remained at the headquarters, told me later that he scolded himself many times for sending me to the search group, and in such an environment, the headquarters again and again sent military pilots to drop food to us. Not only in books, but also in life, there are many difficult situations that end successfully. So it happened with us. One of the helicopter crews somehow managed to fly over and brought us food. The expedition continued. During all this time, experienced hunters from the Mansi people did not leave us. They put teams of deer at our disposal and provided us with fresh meat. The work of the group was supervised by a special staff consisting of responsible employees of the Regional Communist Party Committee, the Regional Executive Committee, and the Military District. The regional prosecutor was a part of the staff of the operations. He boarded the plane and participated in the search. From the Varsegovs, so new sensational details. It turned out that in early March, a hurricane raged for several days in the area of the pass, and the investigator and the searchers had to ski to the nearest village. A beautiful story, especially about the regional prosecutor who blamed himself, but it doesn't look like the truth. None of the dozens of searchers said anything like that. Now, the heading is Set the Time by Photo. Ivanov's writing. It was an ordinary case. It was not even about murder, but about an accident. Therefore, it should not be surprising that the films of tourists and their other documents have not been preserved. The films of the tourists themselves were developed and studied. According to them, by the way, I calculated the start time of the last campout. The last frame in one camera was taken already in the conditions of the strongest blizzard and unsatisfactory visibility. If the sensitivity of the film is known and the boxes are preserved, then the aperture and shutter speed are set, the density of the negative, the longitude of the day, then it is not so difficult to determine the time when the picture was taken. From the Varsegovs. Let's focus on this point in more detail. We're talking about a well-known photo, in which tourists in a snowdrift prepare a place for the tent. The investigation did not establish which of the tourists is depicted in the photo. In the resolution of determination of the case, Ivanov writes, in one of the cameras, a frame taken last has been preserved, which depicts the moment of the excavation of snow for the installation of the tent. Considering that this frame was shot with a shutter speed of 1/25 seconds, with an aperture of 5.6 and a film sensitivity of 65 units GOST, meaning International Technical Standards, and also taking into the account the density of the frame, we can assume that the tourists started to install the tent around 5 p.m. on February 1st, 1959. Let's pay attention to the exact time that Ivanov had determined. At the beginning of February in the northern Urals, twilight begins at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. At 5 p.m., it is already very dark. It seems that the investigator Ivanov is lying again in his official conclusions. But why? Heading about injuries and diaries. Ivanov's writing. The hypothesis about some kind of murder by some soldiers is completely incomprehensible to me. I don't understand anything. Which soldiers? Who killed whom? Firstly, there were no soldiers there at that time. Secondly, they have no external injuries indicating an attack from the Versegovs. How so? A lot of external injuries are described in the acts of forensic medical research. It can be assumed that Lev Nikitich forgot the details after 3 decades. But let's go back to his article written in 1990. In it, he clearly lists which specific ribs were broken in Dubinina and Zolotaryov and the amount of radiation dirt on the tourists' clothes, and about the fact that 2 tourists, Thibault, Brignol, and Slobodin, had their skulls fractured. Did you forget? They can't believe it. Ivanov's writing. About notebooks, I don't remember at all. Above all, if they were, they would not contain any information of interest to us. And then, until the penultimate point, there was a living witness from the Versegovs. Hello again. And what about this statement? I managed to read their diaries, although it took a lot of time then because everything was severely damaged. It was written in his own memoirs. Ivanov's writing. It was Dr. Возрожденный who helped me to understand the mechanism of the origin of the injuries, and taking into account the case materials and my specialty, he helped to establish exactly who died and in what sequence from the Versegovs. Why is there no such important information in the criminal case, neither in the interrogation of Возрожденный nor in the protocols? Ivanov's writings. About radiological examination, you write that it didn't show anything, but I checked objects from the area for radiation and they did not show radioactivity. But the internal organs band studies gave a significant background which indicated directed radioactive guidance. The impression is they were pressed with a fairly wide beam from the Versegovs. We read the conclusion of the radiologist Levashov. It says, the results of the studies do not exceed the average data on the content of radioactive substances in human organs. Now the conclusion. Here's the Versegov statement. We would not like to suspect the respected criminal prosecutor and experienced investigator Lev Ivanov of official forgery, but just his statement about the exact time of the tent installation already leads to vague doubts. It is known that the Lev Ivanov's direct boss, Evgeny Akishev, was a supporter of the rocket missile hypothesis as the cause of the tragedy, and this hypothesis of Akishev's followed from Ivanov's investigations. It is not for nothing that a lot of importance is given to the fireballs in the criminal case known to us, which witnesses tell about. However, this assumption of the investigation, as Evgeny Akishev himself told us, was rejected by the highest authorities. When the media hype about UFOs began in the 1990s, Lev Nikitich Ivanov, who apparently was haunted by the not fully investigated case, suddenly changed the rocket into a UFO. This is a very convenient hypothesis, which is unrealistic to check. So there you have it. This information does not add clarity to one of the most complicated criminal cases of the 20th century. I will call it that until we find out, if ever we do, what happened in the freezing cold of the Ural Mountains in 1959. The story of the demise of the Dyatlov group, of the death of the young people in it, is incredibly complicated. It's time to collect all the archives and materials in one place, to analyze them and draw conclusions. Otherwise, the truth will never be established. Unless there is already a place where the most important data and materials have been collected. But it's not for public consumption, as far as I can say. So this is what I wanted to let you know today. Please stay tuned for further videos about the investigation of this case from Russia. And if you like what I present, if you can support my research, you can do so from the description in this video. You can find out other videos about the Dyatlov Pass tragedy in my channel. I have quite a lot. And please support my work. Please tell others about my channel. Please like my videos. Thank you.